This is Joseph Drust, and welcome back to another episode of AskZBrush. So we had a question sent in asking, how can you clear temporary polygroups when using the ZModeler ALT functionality? So to start off, I have ZBrush loaded up, and I just have a simple model here loaded in that was made with the ZModeler brush. And the question is asking about the temporary polygroup function. So to start off, I first just need to select the ZModeler brush. So I'm going to hit B on my keyboard, I'm going to isolate by the letter Z, and then I'm going to press M. And now I have the ZModeler brush selected. So now I can say come across my model here, and let's say I want to Q mesh this entire flat island. So I'd hover over poly, press spacebar to open up the ZModeler poly action menu. In here I'd make sure I have the Q mesh action selected, and then I'd come down here and set the target to flat island. So now I can come across my model and click and drag, and that's going to perform that Q mesh action across that target of flat island. So let's say I wanted to perform that action here, but I also want to perform it down to maybe these two polys. So this is where this alternate functionality comes in. So let's get back to the original one here where I want to use that flat island. And then I'm going to come down to these two polys here. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and then click. And this is going to assign a temporary white polygroup. So any action you perform is going to be also performed at any polys that contain this white polygroup. So if I go back here to the top and I just use that QMesh flat island, it's going to perform the QMesh across that flat island, but then it's also going to perform the QMesh action to any polys that are tagged with this temporary polygroup. So if I click and drag here, you see it's going to affect that flat island, and it's also affecting the polys that had that temporary polygroup applied. So just an example of this again, I'm just going to undo back to the version here. And let's say I want to do a QMesh flat island to this portion here, and then I just want to use QMesh on these two polys. So I can hold down Alt, click one, click another one. Now I have white polygrouping here. And now I can perform a QMesh flat island over to this part of the mesh, and it's also going to perform it on that part there. And this white temporary polygroup can be placed anywhere. So I could place it here and then perform that flat island. And you can see it's just going to perform that action, whatever action I do next, also onto those polys. So the question is asking about after you have something tagged with the temporary polygroup, how do you get rid of it? So you can always undo by hitting Control Z, but let's say you have a bunch of these polygroups applied and maybe you just accidentally misclicked somewhere, right? So now you have a polygroup that has that white temporary polygroup assigned somewhere else, and now you want to get rid of this. So to get rid of a temporary polygroup, you just need to hold Alt and click it again, and that will remove that temporary polygroup. So if I don't want the temporary polygroup here, and I just want it, say, on this one here, I can now just click Alt and remove it, and now it's only going to perform on that one poly. Now, one thing you will notice is that after you have removed the temporary polygroup, it's going to default to a new polygroup color here. So this area here was all green before I started applying those temporary polygroups. So how can I get these two polys back to be the same polygroup as these guys? So after you've pressed Alt to clear a polygroup, it's going to use the last polygroup that's stored in your brush. So we just need to come through now and just copy this polygroup and then reapply it back to those polys. So to do this, you just need to click and hold and then press Shift, and that will copy the polygroup that's assigned to that poly. So now I have that polygroup stored in this brush. So now if I go to any other poly and click, it's going to now apply that polygroup. So if I want to get this polygroup here to be the same as this one, just go to the poly that has the polygroup you want, click and hold, and then press Shift, and that will copy that polygroup. And then you can now simply click on any other poly, and it's going to apply that polygrouping back to it. So that process again is you hold down Alt and click to assign a temporary polygroup. And then this will allow you to perform any actions to that area as well. So if I do a QMesh, and let's say I do a single poly, and I apply the QMesh action here, it's also going to be performed at any area that has that temporary polygroup. To remove a temporary polygroup, just hover over a poly, hold down Alt, and then click, and that will remove that polygroup. And then once you have that temporary polygroup removed, if you want to get back the polygroup color that was originally there, just hover over a poly with that same polygroup. Press spacebar to go to the ZModeler poly action menu, select the action of Polygroup, then come across that poly again, click and hold, and then press Shift, and that will copy that polygroup. And then now you can just click to assign that polygroup to those other areas. So if you have any other questions related to ZBrush pipelines or processes, please use the hashtag AskZBrush on Twitter. Happy ZBrushing!